All right, we are in 2 Kings chapter 18 tonight. 2 Kings chapter 18. Miss Debbie, I think that's sitting on 1 Kings 18. I thought I'm not ready for that, so. All right. Appreciate Scott teaching last week. I had to put some other people to sleep for a little while, and so y'all got a night off. In 2 Kings 18 and 19, these two chapters are together. There's a lot of dialogue that takes place in these chapters. A lot of attention is given here. It's recorded for us in 18 and 19. It's also recorded for us in Isaiah 36 and 37. It's also recorded in 2 Chronicles 32. There's a lot of significance around this event. Obviously, the narrator spends a long time on it. And if somebody labors over something extensively when they're writing it, it tells you as a reader to pay close attention to it because it is pivotal in its understanding. Because where we have been in chapter 17 is we've seen the north fall, and we've seen Judah mentioned that they are basically doing the same thing, just they're not as far along in the process as Israel is. And so the question kind of lingering in your mind as you're reading it is, will Judah do the same thing? Are they going to end up doing the exact same thing that Israel does? Well, unfortunately they will. That's kind of where the book ends, but it will be a while before that happens. And so here we're introduced to Hezekiah, who is given some pretty high praise throughout the book. Most people see David to be the best king Israel ever had, and I don't think there's really any argument there. But who comes in second place? There's a debate between, in my mind, Hezekiah here and Josiah, who we'll run into a little bit later. And in my judgment, Josiah is an even better king than Hezekiah is. And so it's kind of, you remember when we got to 17, we saw how they had no good kings in the north, but the one that they had at the end was not as bad as the others. There was a clear distinction between them. And it's kind of interesting that before they make their crash, they get a leader that's actually pretty decent. But that just shows you how when sin is so deeply rooted, the reversal process, it can get there so far that the reversal process is almost impossible. And so that's kind of where we are now, looking at Hezekiah. So in these first 12 verses, we just kind of have a summary of his reign, and then from 13 on through 19 gets into the details of this Assyrian assault that takes place. Now there's significant time between what we read about in 17, which is 721 BC, and what we read about here in 2 Kings 18 and 19, which is more like 701-ish, early or late 700s if you're counting down. So let's begin. It says, in the third year of Hoshea, the son of Elah, king of Israel, of course he's connecting it back to the previous chapter, Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. Now you remember in 16 we spent some time on Ahaz, and he was an exceedingly wicked king, pro-Assyrian, adopted idolatry, full-fledged, and things along those lines. Now this is his son. He was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abi, the daughter of Zechariah, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that David his father had done. And that statement, you remember, we've seen some statements previous to this that were along the lines of, he followed the God of David, but the high places weren't taken away. There was kind of that constant refrain. They were good, but they just wouldn't kick the idolatry out. They wouldn't practice it themselves, but they would not, in their jobs as magistrates, enforce that upon the nation and say, this is something that we're not going to do anymore. And he is going to be one that will do that. And so in verse 4 it says, he removed the high places, and he broke the pillars and cut down the Asherah. The pillars have to do with the male deity, and the Asherah is the female deity. As we've talked about before, these images were sexual in their nature, mirroring human anatomy. And The term for Asherah in this verse is actually singular, which gives us the idea that there may have been one particular main site where they all flocked to participate in this worship, and he removes it and makes a bold statement. But then we're also given further insight, and it says he broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, for until those days the people of Israel had made offerings to it, and it was called Nehushtan. And so this is talking about Numbers chapter 21 when they sin in the wilderness and God sends fiery serpents amongst them. Fiery, it wasn't that the serpents were on fire, okay? I think that's pretty obvious, but you never know. They're fiery in the sense that when they bite, there's serious inflammation and burning that goes along with their bite. That's why they're called fiery. And you remember Moses is instructed to lift up the snake, make the snake, and put it on a pole and lift it up, and the people who look at it live. Jesus uses this in John 3. This is actually the background to John 3:16, is lifting up the serpent in the wilderness. And so that image that had been an image of salvation, they had turned it into an image of worship, because in these cultures, those who worshiped the Asherah and other places, they worshiped different animals overcast in bronze. And this you have something that was a symbol of good, they had turned into something that was negative. And so he had to kill it. I'm just going to make this statement and speed by it because I don't want to spend a lot of time here. But there's an important principle here that something, we can appreciate the goodness of something so much, we make it an idol and we refuse to let it go. And I'm thinking about the churches, all churches have their sacred cows that they don't want to let go. There's nothing inherently bad about it. But listen, when it becomes a death grip, you can't touch that cow, it's time to break that thing into a million pieces. Because it's standing between us and God, and we're starting to elevate it to a place that it just doesn't need to be. And so I'm not a guy who, I think when we're all younger, we kind of go anti-tradition. You know, we want to be different, whatever that may be, whatever that looks like. I'm not a guy who really gets caught up in that anymore, and I don't know if that's just my age or what, but you know, a tradition isn't inherently bad. The only time in my mind when I think I would take it upon myself to buck a tradition is when it had been elevated to a position that said, no, if you do this, then, you know, everybody's going to be upset. Well, you know, maybe sometimes we need to be reminded that what we're undoing is just a tradition. Now, one that's not here, that is in other places, and that was, I was required that every time I stepped in that building to teach or preach, even if I wasn't preaching, I had to have a tie on. I got no problem somebody asks me, if my elders ask me to wear a tie all the time. I can do that. My problem comes when you try and tell me that I have to tell other people that they're wrong in their service to God because they don't put one on. That's when it's time to buck a tradition, because you've just made it a law and you can't find it anywhere. Okay? So traditions are things that aren't inherently bad. I mean, this thing right here was used to save a lot of Israelites from their sinfulness. But when you turn it into idolatry, it's time to kick the thing down the road and get rid of it. And I think it's important for us to remember so we don't try and hold on to sacred cows and equate our tradition with what God is saying, what God has said. So in verse 5, he is praised for he trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that there was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those who were before him. For he held fast to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept the commandments of the Lord that the Lord commanded by Moses. And so he's known and he's singled out here for his trust in God, and that will be a central theme to this major story of the Assyrian assault that we'll be reading about here in just a minute. And so he's known for his trust. Now, if you want to, on another occasion, you can look at 2 Chronicles 29, 30, and 31. And there that writer gives a full listing of a lot of the things he did. He restored temple worship. They kept the Passover. Just a lot of good reforms were taking place under Hezekiah. Okay? So he's a good king. He himself is a man of faith. And that is kind of working its way down to the people. Okay? One of the most basic principles of leadership is that leadership sets a tone. there are certain laws of leadership, and one of them is called the law of the lid, which says that your people, whoever you lead, they will never rise any higher than you. You're the ceiling. If you're the manager, if you own the business, you're the ceiling of it. Okay? And that's why then, if you're in a leadership position, it becomes incumbent upon you to constantly push yourself and to grow, because you will stunt the people that are under you. And so your job is to keep pushing and to keep driving, because your growth trickles down to the people who follow you. Okay? So that's what we're seeing here with Hezekiah. Hezekiah decides his father was a wicked idolater. And he says, that's not the way I'm going to lead. I'm going to change things up. I'm going to follow God. And that is going to trickle down from him all the way to the people, to the point that even at the end of this chapter, when he tells them they're going to come and try and scare you, don't listen to them. You know what they do? They listen to him. They listen to him. And so his leadership ability is partly based on convictions. It's kind of hard to follow a person who doesn't have any convictions. I mean, where are you going to go? I don't know. Where do you want to go? What in the world are we doing with you? You're supposed to be leading us somewhere. And you know, and it works the opposite direction too. Some people, one of my favorite Maxwell quotes is, he said, look, if you think you're a leader and nobody's following you, you're not a leader. You're just out taking a walk. If you can't get people to follow you, you're not really a leader. If you're going by yourself, you're just taking a walk. And Hezekiah is one of the many examples we have in Scripture of people who can lead from the top down. And then in verse 7 it says, the Lord was with him wherever he went out, and he prospered. The only other person that is said about is David in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 5, 14, 15, and 16, when he comes to prominence after killing Goliath. Okay, now on top of that, he rebelled against the king of Assyria and would not serve him. So in this back and forth that we've seen in all these kings, pro-Assyrian, anti-Assyrian, he's anti-Assyrian. And by the way, the anti-Assyrian position is the position that God wants them to take. God wants them not to look to anybody else but to himself. Okay? So those who choose an anti-Assyrian position, a lot of them are choosing it just out of practicality or pride. Hezekiah is actually choosing an anti-Assyrian position because of his faith in God. He knows where his trust is supposed to be, that God is supposed to be his deliverer. Now you have to remember that this is in a special covenant with God in these days. Okay? I'm not saying 21st century America should create the military strategy that says we're just going to sit back and let God deliver us. Okay, first of all, 21st century America is not in a special covenant with God, where God has made express promises that says, when you go out to battle, I will fight for you. I will be your deliverer. Don't engage in international politics. That covenant doesn't exist. Okay? So we have to be careful that we don't take special circumstances in the Old Testament and try and apply them to modern day situations. So he rebels against him, and then he also struck down the Philistines, which were, it's recorded not only in Scripture but in several other places, including the Assyrian king that's going to give him so much trouble here in just a minute. But it's also, nobody has really beaten down the Philistines this way since David. And so what the writer is trying to get us to see is this guy is like a second David. That's the way he's painting him. He's that good. So he strikes down the Philistines as far as Gaza and its territory. Gaza is one of the 5 lordship cities, from watchtower to fortified city. And so from watchtower, your major cities, your major strongholds, to just your watchtowers, just little locations that are just lookout cities. So basically it's saying he got them all. Every single thing, no matter how big or how little, he has taken every one of them. So that's the introduction to Hezekiah's character. Now we're kind of put in a chronological discussion in 9 through 12. It says, in the 4th year of King Hezekiah, which was the 7th year of Hoshea the son of Elah, the king of Israel, Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against Samaria and besieged it. That's what we read about in chapter 17. At the end of 3 years, he took it in the 6th year of Hezekiah, and was the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Israel. Samaria was taken. So all he's doing is just chronologically placing and overlapping these chapters. The king of Assyria carried the Israelites away to Assyria and put them into Hala and on Habor and the river Gozan and the cities of the Medes. This is all areas kind of in Babylon, Assyrian area, in Mesopotamia, in that particular region. Because they did not obey the voice of the Lord their God, but transgressed his covenant, even all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded, they neither listened nor obeyed. Okay? So he's just reminding us once again why they're gone. And then he's going to present us with a situation where they're going to be in the same position. We just read about Samaria was besieged as a city. You encircle them, you starve them out. That's how you work. That's exactly what's fixing to happen to Judah. Okay? They're going to be besieged. They're going to be threatened by the same army, different king. Shalmaneser dies in the siege of Samaria, and a different king will take over. And so that lingering question is Judah going to do what Israel did? Well, the answer here is no, Hezekiah's not going to let him. He's going to handle it the right way. And so let's move then and look at this. Like I say, from this point forward, all the way through chapter 19, we're dealing with that single event of Assyria coming and trying to take Judah as well. So Sennacherib's invasion begins. Sennacherib is the king of Assyria at this time. Now, before he gets here, this is his third campaign that he takes. He's going to take 8 total. This is his third. He already has, in his third campaign, he has conquered 46 fortified cities. Fortified cities means they're built specially to withstand besieging. Very major cities. He's got more than 200,000 POWs. Okay? He has just kind of had his way with anybody. Matter of fact, a lot of times, the reason why the Assyrians were so brutal, and brutal they were, the reason why they were so brutal was so that when they went to a city and surrounded it, they could do what they're fixing to try and do to Israel and say, hey, just give up now. Don't put yourself through it. You see, if you make an example out of one or two, this is the way tyranny works, right? That's the way tyranny works. You make an example of one or two, then you tell all the others that you won't be like them. And it has a way of kind of squelching people's desire to rise up and to even put forth a fight. So, 13, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, he's roughly 39 years old, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. So all the cities specifically built to withstand an onslaught or an invasion, he has taken every one of them. So the only thing that is left in Judah is Jerusalem, the capital. Okay? So it's a dire situation. Basically, once you take the capital, that's it. During the American Civil War, there was a lot of issues about that. There were moments where Lincoln's lieutenants were so incompetent that the Union very well could have lost. If all the South would have done was launch the invasion, it was over. Within a year, it was over, done for, okay, in protecting the capital city. And they could have had it without a problem. But they didn't, thankfully. So understanding the significance of the capital, the morale of the people, that's where the majority of your leadership is, it's pretty significant. So the capital is, to Assyria, the last thing to go, and then they will have everything completely under their control. So in verse 14, Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish. Lachish is a city about 30 miles southwest of Jerusalem. It's a pretty significant city. Was kind of like a second palace area at times to certain kings. And he's saying to Sennacherib, I have done wrong. Withdraw from me. Withdraw from me. That is, he rebelled against Assyria, as we read about in verse 7. and he's saying, I made a mistake. So let's try and work this out, is what he's saying. Also, by the way, for Lachish, Assyria's invasion of Lachish, there are, what are they called? I want to call them inscription. That's not what it is. It's kind of like wall art. Anyway, they're in the British Museum. Okay, you can Google them. They're there. About Sennacherib's invasion of Lachish. So it's just kind of another interweaving. The Bible doesn't happen detached from reality. A lot of people look at the Bible and they think it's just this like special thing that's happening. There is so much history converging, and we haven't touched we haven't even tried to talk about all that when we've been in here, because that can go cross-eyed pretty quickly. But anyway, it's there if you want to look it up. He says, whatever you impose on me, I will bear. So he's basically willing to submit to them. You just tell me what my tribute is. So the king of Assyria required of Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold, roughly the equivalent of $5 billion. I honestly don't even know if he's being serious at this moment, because the way the text is going to unfold is when Hezekiah goes and tries to get the money, he comes anyway to destroy the city. So it kind of makes you wonder, was he just kind of being off $5 billion? The answer being nothing. I'm not letting you out of this. Maybe. So Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and the treasuries of the king's house. That time Hezekiah also stripped the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the doorposts that Hezekiah, king of Judah, had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. So Hezekiah pays it. He tries to come up with it, and he does exactly what previous kings have done. He raids the temple. Now, there is a good deal of comfort, I think, that can be found in what Hezekiah is doing here. Now, what Hezekiah is doing is wrong. He should not have paid this. Okay? So here you have Hezekiah in a moment of weakness, not doing what he's supposed to be doing. He should have told the Assyrian king, here I am, come get me. Or, you know, how kings talk to each other. A nicer, probably a less than nice way of saying it. He does not. He gives in. Now, what's interesting is so taking and stealing from the temple to pay the ransom is an indication that he's not trusting God the way that he should. But when we were just given a short synopsis of his reign, what was the thing that was singled out for him? That no one had ever, that it says of him, he blank God more than any other. He followed. He trusted. And here you have an occasion where he's obviously not trusting. So, the thing that I see when I look at that is this. One blunder in an area doesn't have to define the rest of your stinking life. God doesn't see it that way. Now, with other people, some of them, hey, nothing in the world you can do about it. Right? Solomon talks about the more practical side of it in Proverbs. In particular, he talks about the sin of adultery. You get a mark that will not be taken away. From that point forward, the majority of people that see you, they're always going to, when your name is brought up, they're always going to attach your name to that sin, regardless of the fact that God has said that sin no longer exists. I've wiped it away. Practically, some people are never going to let you outlive that, and you have to come to peace with that. But on the whole, in God's estimation, even though Hezekiah has a major lapse in judgment here in trust, God looks at him and says, there wasn't a king that ever really trusted me the way he did. I don't know about you, but I goof pretty regularly. And I'd rather not have my entire life characterized by mistakes. There's a difference between making mistakes and living mistakes. Making mistakes are isolated moments. They're contrary to what you normally do. Living mistakes, that's your lifestyle. So here you have a man who's praised by God for trusting him, and the first picture that God paints of him is a time when he didn't trust him. That moment does not have to define you. And that, a lot of Christians need to hear that, because a lot of them are struggling with sin and they let it beat them and drive them into the ground. And, it turns into, there's no way God could, look at what a mess I am. Hey, let's not go nuclear for a second, okay? You made a mistake. Obviously, you're upset about that, okay? So, but let's not take this thing to the nth degree that says, now, my life is over and my worth is gone. No. An isolated moment will not be the defining moment, okay? When God looks at us, he's looking at the totality of our lives and how we run the race well. And faithfulness. There's a difference that we have to understand. There is a difference between perfection and direction. We're not perfect people. God's not asking us to be that. He's asking us to walk in the right direction. I don't know about you. Sometimes I stumble when I walk. I had a weak ankle, always did as a kid, and I would roll that thing all the time. Step on just any little thing, and I'd roll it. Did that mean I changed my direction and gave up? No, you get up, take a second, you keep walking in the same direction. This is 1 John 1. This is why John writes that. To say that God is not expecting perfection, he's looking for the direction of our lives. Where are we headed? What is our commitment level to something? There is a difference between embracing sin, which is going the other direction, and falling down on your face and sinning along the way as you walk. Those are two different things. And I'm glad you got something like Hezekiah here, because it helps me to sleep a little better at night. Yep. Exactly. Exactly. Ezekiel 18, that all of those scenarios are he plays out and writes out very clearly. So it just depends, and we're going to see that in another chapter here in a little bit, actually. Okay, so let's move then to this meeting that's going to take place. It says, the king of Assyria sent the Tartan and the Rabsaris and the Rabshakeh with a great army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem. And they went up and they came to Jerusalem. And when they arrived, they came and stood by the conduit of the upper pool, which is in the highway of the washer's field. And when they called for the king, there came out to them Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, and Shebna, the secretary, and Joah, the son of Asaph, the recorder. And so obviously the kings aren't meeting, their representatives are at this point. Okay? Now, the Tartan and the Rabsaris and the Rabshakeh, these are titles. They're not their individual names. The Tartan means the supreme commander. The Rabsaris means chief officer. And the Rabshakeh means the field commander. And so these are definitely major players in this move. So they go up to Jerusalem, and they stand by the conduit of the upper pool, which is on the highway of the washer's field. Now that is significant. And let's see if we can explain why. Okay. So Hezekiah's father is Ahaz. Okay? Ahaz, you remember, was invaded by a group of nations that were trying to overthrow him and set up a different king. And God sets up a meeting between Isaiah and Ahaz. And God assures Ahaz that this is not going to happen to you. They're not going to win. And he tells Ahaz, he says, ask for me a sign that I'm going to take care of. And he says, no, I'm not going to ask. And this is where God gets in and says, okay, but I'm going to give you one anyway. And it's Isaiah 7. Virgin shall conceive and bear a son, call his name Emmanuel. These types of scenarios, okay? So what you have there in Isaiah 7, Ahaz, Hezekiah's father, is being threatened. God sends a prophet to him and says, God's going to protect you. Ask him a sign. And Ahaz says, I don't want a sign. He doesn't he does not take the counsel of God is the point. Okay? Now, what we're going to have here, where this meeting is taking place, is the same place that Isaiah and Ahaz had their meeting. Now you've got a meeting between the representatives of Assyria and the representatives of Hezekiah. And now Ahaz's son sits in the same shoes, basically, that his dad did. And so the writer is expecting us to understand that historically and to put these two things kind of in a juxtaposition against each other so that we can see them and contrast them. Whereas Ahaz rejected God and would not seek his counsel or his command, here Hezekiah is going to do just the opposite. And so he's painting for us this picture of contrast between father and son, between a king who trusts in idolatry and a king who trusts in God. And so that's the significance of this particular meeting place. Now this pool, this conduit, Hezekiah's conduit as it is known, they built it for the sieging of the city, or the besieging of the city, so they could get water into the city. It has been discovered, it has been excavated completely from one end to the other. You can, from what I remember, you can walk all the way down the thing if you want to today. And as a matter of fact, this conduit was where we kind of solidified the understanding that a cubit was 18 inches. Because they wrote the dimensions, they carved the dimensions on the wall when they were working on it. And so they said so many cubits, and then we were able to measure it, and those cubits worked out perfectly to 18 inches. And so that kind of gave us some solidification in understanding that. And so this is a pretty significant place because it's the water supply of the city. So there's that bell. So we will stop there, which is actually a pretty good place to stop. And then we will look at this psychological warfare that starts taking place. All warfare is psychological in its nature. And that's the way this is going to start. It's just a big old bully. And I don't happen to like bullies. So neither does God. So he's going to handle this very well. And so we will hopefully look at that and should be able to finish that pretty quickly next week because it's just conversations back and forth and back and forth. So we'll pick up there.